So, having spoken at a high level about offer, agreement, etc., shall we talk now about what an offer is, how you recognise one at a party? So what is an offer? What do you reckon an offer is? How would you recognise an offer if you came across one? Let me practice. I want to make sure I get your name. Robert?
Something that gives enough detail so that if I said, yep, that's what I've agreed to, there'd be enough substance to it. We both knew what we were agreeing to.
Something, a statement or a question that gives enough detail so that if somebody simply says yes, both parties would know what they've agreed to or what their rights and obligations are. Absolutely. Anybody want to add to that? Subtract from it?
An offer, it's a kind of request for an agreement to meet someone else in needs in a particular thing.
So an agreement, I'm repeating for the recording, but also so I have time to think it through. An agreement is something, a statement that is made to someone that gives them enough information. Sorry, I lost the train. You say that again?
So the offer is it's a kind of a request for an agreement.
Okay, an offer is a request for an agreement.
And based on some particular conditions.
Based on some particular conditions.
To meet a specific need.
To meet a specific need or exchange some particular thing.
Some particular thing between two parties.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a strong definition. I think it's kind of one of those elephant in the room questions though, isn't it? You feel like you're going to know an offer when you see one, but to actually describe what it is quite difficult to do, particularly when we put them in circumstances. So an offer is an indication, statement, question, by one person who we call the offeror to another person. Now that's important. We need to identify who that party is, usually, who we call the offeree, of their willingness to enter into a contract with the offeree on certain terms. So exactly as Rowan and Bishoy said before, there needs to be enough information in the offer so that we know what the rights and obligations of the parties are. An offer itself can't give rise to a contract, but it creates in the offeree the power to do so. So provided that all of the elements of a contract will be present, so the offer is sufficiently explicit, and as we go through, we'll realise that actually lots of terms can be implied, lots of things can happen, you don't need a lot of detail here. But provided that there are all of the elements at present, by making the offer, the offeror creates a situation where the offeree is the one who creates the contract. So by saying yes, or doing the thing that creates the contract is made. Of course, that assumes that at the time the offeree does that thing to accept or says those words to accept, that the offer itself hasn't been withdrawn or hasn't lapsed. So, as we unpick this, we're going to have to remind ourselves about unilateral and bilateral contracts. Features of a unilateral contract. In a unilateral contract, we have two parties. We're going to call them A and B. Only one promise is made by A. So $100 if you find my lost puppy. B accepts the offer when they perform the required task, they find the puppy. And a contract is formed at that moment. So at the moment it's formed, B has done everything that they need to do. They've actually fulfilled or executed their agreement, their obligations under the agreement, and A becomes bound. So the offeror becomes bound at that moment. And that's why it's called unilateral. It's called unilateral because only one party has to do anything at a time. Now these are pretty rare, but you need to be able to identify them. Mostly we'll talk about simple bilateral contracts, where A makes an offer to B, B says, yes, that sounds good to me, and accepts it. The contract is formed, and both parties have obligations at that point in time. So, at risk of over-egging this entirely, and largely because I'm very proud of my handwritten animated drawing, this is what a unilateral contract looks like. We have an offeror who makes an offer. At that point in time, they have no obligations whatsoever. So nothing they need to do until acceptance is undertaken, and they can withdraw their offer at any time. The offeree at that point in time also has no obligation to do anything. But if they do what the offeror asks, then a contract is made. The offeree could be anyone, or it could be a particular class of people. It could be an offer to the world, and we'll talk about that particularly in Carhill in a moment, but it could be to a class of people. So I will offer a free hour of tutoring to anybody in this class who clicks on a link at 6:30 on Sunday night. I'll talk to you about that in a minute. Yes, please.
Is it right to say that in any bilateral contract, at the time of agreement occurs, or acceptance occurs by conduct?
Yeah, acceptance occurs by conduct or by doing things. Now the conduct might be paying money. Could be paying money. Could be being somewhere at a particular time. It could be anything, but it's at a point in time. And then we've got our one carve out. If the offer stipulates it could be anyone unless the offer stipulates a particular class. And if the offer is withdrawn before it's accepted, then accepting later doesn't matter. It doesn't create a contract. So once a unilateral contract is made, the offeror is bound and the offeree has rights. Yes, you have to remind me of your name, I've got to ask.
SJ.
SJ, thank you.
Would that withdrawal, so in that scenario you just put up there where it's then a contract's made, provided that the offer hasn't been withdrawn prior, does that withdrawal have to be, so like in that Carlo example where it's the newspaper advertisement, if they were to, prior to, this is Carlo or whoever putting her plate, if they had to put like a revocation in a similar newspaper or...
We'll talk, I'll put that to one side because we will talk about when offers are revoked, but you're absolutely right, because there's that question about whether the revocation needs to be communicated or not, and the short answer is yes. Unless you can objectively see that the offer has been withdrawn, it doesn't matter what you intended. What it matters is what the world saw. So it's usual in a unilateral contract that the offeror has nothing, the offeree has nothing more to do at a point in time. Now I can think of plenty of examples where that might not be true, for example. Like we might have a unilateral contract where we're essentially offering to the world scholarships on achieving a particular grade point average or whatever. You don't have to apply, you get a grade point average, you get this scholarship, but you need to maintain that grade point average in order to keep it. So that would be an example where you would have an ongoing obligation. It's not really an obligation because you would just lose it at a point in time. It would be a series of contracts, but you can see what I mean. I'm thinking this out loud. Bilateral contracts, easier to understand, much, much messier to draw. So in a bilateral contract, agreement's reached and the contract is made at the time consensus ad idem is achieved, when the parties when that offer is accepted without change. An offer that's not been withdrawn, that's sufficiently clear, represents the elements of a contract is achieved. And so at the point that the offer is accepted, the contract is made, and then both parties will have rights under it, and both parties will have obligations under it. And that will make more sense to you when we talk about consideration. So what is an offer and how do we identify it in the wild? Mentioned a couple of times already, an offer, in order to decide whether an offer is in fact been made or not, courts will use an objective test. Doesn't matter what the parties actually intended, what matters is what a person in the position of the offeree would have understood by that conduct or that statement, having the same knowledge. The intention of the offeror is irrelevant. Intention itself is ascertained from the point of view of a reasonable person in the offeree's position, having that same knowledge. So that means that one offeror making the same offer to two people, court might see that differently depending on the relationship. So one party, if I've had a 10-year relationship with somebody and they know that I am full of BS and that I joke around all the time and I've made some ridiculous offer to buy their notes for $1 million, that might be quite different understanding as far as the court's concerned from somebody that I've just met, that I've made that same offer to. Depends on the circumstances. And the offer itself needs to provide all the information required so the terms can be identified where the offer is accepted. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that we need a 15-page document every time we buy a cup of coffee. We might be able to ascertain those terms from a whole range of other things, but the terms themselves need to be understood. So offer and certainty are really closely linked together here. Questions, concerns, frustrations? Thank you for giving me a chance to have a drink. Rowan?
I thought I read, and I can't be more specific, but I thought I read that the reasonable person test looked at it from both sides, whether it would be like a reasonable person would make that offer.
So the question is, reasonable person, the question is it a reasonable offer as opposed to, so we look at it in two ways, I guess. Firstly, you're accepting that the court will think about whether it's what is reasonable for the offeree to understand. The other part is, and I assume you're thinking about my example there, I've offered to buy somebody a note for $1 million. That's kind of patently ridiculous because I get to set the test, so I'm not going to ask you about stuff I don't already know the answer to, so why do I need your notes? And $1 million does seem a little bit high, although I've seen how well organised Michelle's notes are. Ridiculous offer? I might be incredibly wealthy. It doesn't matter, we'll talk about this in consideration. One of the maxims of consideration is consideration needs to be sufficient, doesn't need to be adequate. So, and which goes both ways. It's not the role of the courts to work out whether it's a good or a bad deal. Now, a patently ridiculous offer, that might impact what a sensible offeree will think and what they might understand. But if a court will not actually knock something over just because it's not a commercial offer or it's not a reasonable offer as such, that's not what the role of the courts are. But we will talk about that when we get to consideration. Excellent question.